how many of you have troubles in the openings? I know I did. I have a lot of troubles in the openings. And when I started to play chess, I didn't know what to do in the opening, okay? I had a real problem because all of my pieces, let's say I was playing the white, the rook on A1, the pawns on the second rank, all of them were saying, move me, move me. And how did I decide which was, yeah, I had a real problem. So a lot of my opening play when I started to play chess was completely random. But I had this image in my mind, okay, I imagined that I was the general of my army. And for some strange reason, the pieces in my army were, I created an image for them. So what I imagined my rook was a cannon. You know, pow, shoot ahead. And I imagined my knight was like a horse, but with a guy riding on top, like a knight from the medieval ages. And I imagined him just jumping all over the board, like a cavalryman. The bishops, I thought, were archers, whoosh, you know, flying down the diagonals. And my queen, I imagined, was a bully. She just beat up everybody she came in contact with. She was the strongest, most powerful piece. So I thought that would be a really good idea to put my cannons, that is to say my rooks, in position, and my opening moves were usually this move. So what was the idea of this move? What do you think, young man? To get the rook out. My opponent would usually play d5 to stop me from getting the rook out, but I would move my rook anyway. What do you think my opponent would do? What do you think? Of course, the bishop would take the rook. And I was like, darn it, he got my rook. And then I thought, but I was very clever. I actually started the game with 2 rooks. So instead of recapturing the bishop, which I would do, I should do rather, I would play this. Does this look like a real beginner's move? Yes. Yeah. And this is the way I played. I lost lots of games. My opponents, some of them would move the bishop back, and then I would get to bring my cannon. Some other clever people would play this move, and you know what I do?
You still move.
I still move the rook. Okay. I still move the rook.
And then it takes you.
And he'd take my other rook. And I'd feel defeated because it was like, man, my opponent sees everything. He sees everything. He knows what I'm going to do. So as you could see, I was a pretty terrible chess player, and I lost all my games. I mean, I really, really had a problem. I was pretty lousy. Okay. Then I evolved in my thinking. I said, wait a minute. What did I think my queen was? What was my queen?
Trapped.
It's trapped, but it's also a bully. I thought, right. My strategy of developing my cannons on move 1 and 2 and 3, they didn't work very well. I figured I got to bring out my queen as early and as often as possible. So I would make a move, like any move that would open a path for my queen. As I got better as a player, I would move either the D pawn or the C pawn or the E pawn. E pawn became my favorite. And my opponents would usually play a move like this, and then I would bring my queen out. And I'm ready. And boy, I tell you, it was the most fun when they moved their bishop. Why? Why was that good for me? I loved it when a young man in the back. You bet, boy. I love to take this pawn on G7. And I would then take the rook, try to take the knight, and take this pawn, and wipe out as much of my opponent's army as I could. And I was just delighted because I actually won 1 or 2 games. I had lost a lot of games, but I won for the first time with my strategy. Tigran.
There's actually kind of no way to lose your knight because once you take the G7 pawn,
Yeah, let's say he goes
then-
here.
yeah,
I take
then
the-
you take the rook,
Yeah, and I'm attacking the knight.
and then like perhaps you move something else, like king.
Well, he could protect the knight, or he could protect the knight maybe with his queen.
Yeah.
But either way, then I would wipe out that pawn and I feel real good. I like, okay. So my queen strategy was wrong, but on some occasions I won a game or two and I was convinced I was right. Later, as I played stronger opponents, I realized that my queen strategy just didn't work against somebody who didn't allow me to capture their material, like the pawn on G7. So now I had to change my thinking. How do I become better in the openings when my cannon strategy failed, when my bully strategy failed? And I needed an understanding, okay? And this is where I really started to get good. I had a different attitude about the opening because now somebody told me about the battlefield. The chessboard battlefield, if you put your hand on the chessboard, it feels flat, right? So all the squares are the same. But a good general knows that's not true. That there are actually high points on the battlefield, and these 4 squares, E4, E5, D5, and D4, these 4 squares are the highest on the battlefield. It's like they're the big hill. These 4 squares are the most important squares, and the squares that immediately surround them are on a second hill. So it's like everything is flat, every other square is flat. Then these squares from F3 to F4 to F5 to F6 to E6 to D6 to C6 to C5 to C4 to C3 and back across D3, E3, F3, they're high ground, and then these squares are the highest ground. I go, oh, that's cool. Now I'm a good general. Now I understand the battlefield, and it's important to control the high ground. Now I began to understand something else about the opening. All of our opening moves should be aimed at controlling the center. We should always aim to control the center. So now I had a new concept, a new idea that I had to control the center. I had to control the center. So now I began to understand what my original opening move, this move, H4, is this a good move in terms of controlling the center?
No.
In fact, it's a lousy move because it's a move on the flank and it does nothing to control the center. And it was like, oh my gosh, I was playing terribly. So my opening move became, this was my favorite opening move, what we call the king pawn or E2, E4. Now why was this opening move so good? Because it controlled D5, it attacked F5, and it occupied the sweet center, the E4 square. Now let us say that let's choose a move for our opponent that also controls the center. What's a good move? Young man, yes. Which one? E5. That's a fine move. This is a classical defense. So when we talk about white's move, we talk about white opening. When we talk about black's move, we talk about black's defense. So white opened with his king pawn, black defended with a classical king pawn defense. So what do we think? This knight starts shouting at me. This knight says, move me, move me. This other knight says, no, 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 don't move him, move me. I want to get into the game. So would this move be a good move?
No.
You all are saying no. I thought that that would be a good move, but why? Can somebody tell me why it's not a good move? Young man in the orange, yes, you.
Because you're on the flank and you're not controlling anything on the center.
Exactly. So now that is perfectly explains what I was thinking. This knight is moving away from the center, so it wasn't a very good move. Tigran's move, d2, d3, is very, very attractive to me at the time that I was starting to understand how to control the center. The reason why d2, d3 was very attractive is because this bishop on c1 was... Yeah, exactly. The bishop on c1, it's riding the bench, man. It's not in the game. It's saying, get me into the game. So as I was ready to play the move to d2, d3, this other bishop, it started shouting. It said, don't move the d-pawn. Why did this bishop shout, don't move the d-pawn? Correct, because now its way has been blocked by the pawn. So what I decided to do was bring my bishop out to c4. So I would develop my bishop, and in my mind, this was a really, really good move because it controlled the sweet center square d5. Okay? Now let's say my opponent is quite good themselves, and they played the move knight on g8 to f6, playing in the center, attacking my pawn on e4. Tigran, how did I respond?
Knight to f3.
Knight to f3. That would be a counter attack against the pawn on e5. I wasn't very sophisticated enough to play such an outstanding move as knight f3. I actually played your move. I played d2, d3. The reason I played d2, d3 is because I was actually getting good, and I could see that my pawn was being attacked by this knight, so I defended the pawn that was in the sweet center.
So he protected it too?
Well, now it's black's turn. The other reason I was now happy to play d3, because I would open up my bishop. Now let's say my opponent played d5. Ooh, my opponent's pretty good too. He's exactly, that move controls both the d5 square, the sweet center square, and the e4 square, and it attacks my bishop. Okay, exactly. Oh no is right. So I started thinking, what should I do? I was afraid, okay? I was afraid that if I moved my bishop backwards, my opponent would take a pawn, and I could see that that would result in a lost pawn position for me. I like my pawns. I didn't want to lose my pawns. I wanted to keep them. So I played differently. What did I play in this position? What did I do? Young man? Yes. I did. I took the pawn. e4 captures d5. Yes, but at least I've captured a pawn. So for the moment, I'm a pawn ahead. Now, my opponent did a good move. He took the pawn with the knight. Okay? Now, That is a strong move. Now it's even Stevens on the material. I've won upon my opponent. Right. Don't take the knight. Now, I was thinking in this position, sorry? Can I make him in check? I don't know. I was thinking that in this position that I respected what my opponent had done, because in my mind I understood that he had opened up the way for both of his bishops, and that's pretty good. My opponent is ready to develop his bishops quickly. But, and this is important, I still hadn't overcome my belief that the queen was a bully. And I like that idea of jumping out with my queen with a big surprise. And so, what move do you think I made? Young man.
Queen to F3?
I did. I played queen to F3. So, what was going on in my mind's eye? For the first time in my chess career, I was coordinating my pieces. My queen...
That's a bad move.
It is a bad move. My queen attacks this pawn, but more importantly, my bishop and my queen cooperate to attack the knight on d5. I loved it when my opponent moved his knight away, because now I didn't worry about knight takes c2 checking my king and winning the rook, because I have a checkmate. I would play queen takes f7 checkmate.
Plus, the bishop is protecting the queen.
Because the bishop... So this was a kind of a coordination of my pieces that up to this moment in my career, I didn't understand. That the pieces can work together as a team. Now, my really good opponents, they did not move their knight. They protected the knight with their bishop.
But it's not going to protect the queen.
Yes. At the moment, the queen on d8 protects the knight once, but I attack the knight on d5 twice. So now the knight is protected.
It's all about the knights.
Now it's all about the knights. So now I still understood the idea that I needed to play in the center. I needed to play central control. And what move could I make that made sense to attacking the center? What move can I make? Tigran again.
Well, the bad news is that the queen is blocking the f3 space, which would attack the pawn on e5.
Correct. The queen, a really good move for white would be able to develop the knight to its most natural square, f3, which would attack the pawn on e5. Now I understood that the queen was in the way on f3, and I should move my queen. So I played the move queen e4, getting out of the way for the knight, but also attacking the pawn on e5. What do you think my opponents did? Young man.
They might have played pawn c6 because you have to think of it.
Okay, pawn c6 is not a bad move, as it defends the knight one more time, but it doesn't address the very specific threat that I had in mind, which is capturing the pawn. Can black defend the pawn on e5 while developing his pieces? Young man in orange, yes.
You can move his queen to d6.
That's a good move. He could move his queen to d6. Could he move his bishop to d6?
Yes.
Yes? How many think you could move the bishop to d6? Well, first of all, congratulations, it's legal.
What?
It's illegal.
It's legal. That is, according to the rules, you can move your bishop to d6. You haven't suggested an illegal move. Now, I forgot that I was playing a very sophisticated opponent. And when my opponent played bishop d6, my eyes lit up because I was greedy and I thought I saw an opportunity. What opportunity do you think I saw, young man?
Your white bishop takes d5.
Yes! Yes! I was so happy. The white bishop on c4 captures the knight, and I look forward to a winning game. Bishop takes.
I think that's actually a bad move.
We'll find out if that's true. Bishop takes, queen takes. Now, in this exact position, I had a big smile on my face. Why? Because I did something that I should not do. It was a trap that I fell for. I always looked and counted the pieces that came off the board. So at this exact moment, I was thrilled that I was a piece ahead. I have an extra knight. Bishop and knight, bishop and knight, but I have an extra knight, and I thought I could win. Instead of concentrating on what comes off the board, your concentration should always be what's on the board. Now, what move did black make that made me want to cry? Young man, what did I do? What did
Bishop to b4.
Bishop to b4 check.
Oh, I see it.
Oh, I didn't see that either. This was brutal. I was thinking about the piece I was ahead by looking off the board and didn't realize, I didn't even know what this kind of maneuver was called. It's called a discovered check. The bishop moves with a check to my king, but he also, his queen, makes a discovered attack against my queen.
Hurts.
That did hurt. Yes, young man.
Move your knight to c3.
Yes, indeed. I could move my knight to c3. The problem is that when he takes my queen, my knight is in an absolute pin. There are two types of pins. Do you know what they're called? There's two types of pins. Young man.
A normal pin and an absolute pin.
Correct.
A normal pin is when there's a piece behind it, but it's not the king, so you can move it. But when the king is behind it, you can't put it in check.
Correct. So an absolute pin is that this knight is absolutely pinned. It cannot move. Now, if there was a rook instead of the king, the knight could move, but at the cost of the rook. So there's just a normal pin or a pin, and there's an absolute pin. In this case, I'm in an absolute pin, and I lose my queen.
That must hurt.
That did hurt. So in my effort, I'm going to lose my queen. I realized, I wanted to take as many pieces as my opponent as I could for my queen. Tigran, what did I play?
So, a better move would be to play c2 to c3.
That's what I played. I blocked the check to my king by attacking my opponent's bishop. Now, unfortunately for me, my opponent was really good. He captured my queen.
Now he has no bishop.
Correct. So what did I do? I took the bishop, and I was super, super happy. Well, not really happy. I had a bishop and knight, and he had my queen. Now, what did my opponent do? Give it some thought. What did my opponent do? Young man.
He took the pawn on your
He took the pawn on g2. Remember that moment ago, and I was showing that my queen was a bully, and I would take this pawn and take the rook and take the knight? Guess what just happened to me?
He did the same thing.
He did the same thing to me that I wanted to do to him. He took my pawn, and there was no way I could defend my rook. So he would wipe me out. And now I realized, I think this knight should be over here. Sorry, I apologize. I realized that my strategy of moving out my queen early
Isn't that good?
is not that good.
But later on in the game, it's better.
Correct. Bringing out the queen later in the game is much better. So now, I still would get these positions, this position. I'd open with my king pawn. My opponent, hey, this is kind of cool. I think I just discovered a pawn. My opponent made the king pawn defense. I'd bring out my bishop. Later, I make a fantastic discovery. Do you know what I discovered? What do you think I discovered? What do you think? I discovered that, but I also discovered that every move that I make in the opening
Has a catch.
that plays towards the center has a name. And that a lot of books have been written about chess openings, and I discovered that this opening move, bishop c4, has a name. Do you know what the name of the opening is? Are you ready for this? It's a real good one. It's called the Tigran? Nope. It's called the bishop's opening. I wonder why.
Because it's a bishop.
There you go. Chess is a logical game. Now, we're going to continue from that position that we had a moment ago. I defended the pawn with my pawn. My opponent plays here. I took. My opponent took. Tigran?
Move the knight.
Yes. That was the next stage in my development. I realized that my move queen f3 was a mistake because
The knight
it stepped in the way of the knight. But I was stubborn. All great chess champions have a stubborn streak in them. What I mean by that is they believe in their own ideas. You should too.
Hey,
Yes.
I just discovered something.
What?
Even if you still move the queen to f3, you can move the knight to e2.
That's correct. I could move the knight to e2 thereafter. But I thought that my knight deserves the f3 square. I still believed at that time that my queen was a bully, and instead of moving my queen to f3, I moved it to h5.
To bully the king.
Correct. To bully the king on f7, and I really, really, really loved it when my opponents played here. Why? Young man in the blue.
You could take
Oops, the blue, yeah.
the pawn on e5.
Check! I would love to take the pawn on e5 check. First of all,
It wouldn't make that.
my good opponents wouldn't, but some of them would fall for it, and if they moved their bishop, I'd take the rook. If they moved their queen, well, I'd have to trade queens, but I won a pawn. My good opponents, they played knight to c6, defending the pawn on e5. Now, remember what we had a moment ago. We had a problem with our knight. That knight on g1 wasn't effective. But now, ta-da!
It's all about the pawn now.
Well, now, man, this is really cool. It's about the pawn, and I want to play the move knight takes e5. I'm really, really happy. Okay. Now you see that I'm starting to understand that I should coordinate with my pieces. I'm starting to, a moment ago my bishop and queen were coordinating. Now my knight and queen are coordinating. And I'm really, really dreaming that he will attack my queen.
But that won't be.
Why would that be a terrible move? Young man in the blue.
Because you have mate on your side.
Yes! That is exactly right. Our famous, the same checkmate I fell for 20 times, I get a couple in myself. So my opponents would understand that this pawn is attacked by the knight and by the queen. And if they defended the pawn with this move, this would be a bad move. Why would that be a bad move? Young man.
You take the knight.
Correct. I could take the knight. Remember last time there was a discovered check against my queen? Would a discovered check not still be good for my opponent?
Yeah?
No.
Yeah, it's check to my king, and he's... Sorry? Why? What could I do against discovered check, young man? C3, correct. And then if he took my bishop, what could I do? I take his bishop, and he has bishop knight, I have knight bishop knight. So I actually win material. So the move bishop d6, correct. So the move bishop d6 is actually wrong, and my opponents, instead of defending this pawn, they attack my queen.
That's a hard move.
Now, my queen doesn't have so many squares to move to. My queen, if it moves here, why is this square bad? Young man in the back. Remember when I used to lose my rook on h3? Same thing. You take my queen. Exactly. So my queen can't move here. My queen can't move h6 because of the bishop. I'd have to move to g5 or h4. I would choose the move g5, and then they would trade queens. I would take with the bishop, and I haven't won anything. Tigran, yeah.
I was just stretching.
Okay, so now my opponent could simply defend the knight, or maybe now he could go on the offensive, and I had lost the initiative. My opponent has the ability to make threats against my position. So I finally realized a very important lesson, which you guys seem to know already, which is don't move the queen out early. But I kept trying until finally I got it. Don't move the queen out early. So it took me a long while, but I started to get better. And instead of moving my queen out, I moved my knight. Okay?
Good move.
Yes, that's what I thought. Now I'm attacking the pawn on e5. What do you think my strong opponents would do? What do you think my strong opponents would do? They would defend the pawn on e5 by moving their knight out. Seems fair, right? Now I did something that was very, very important. In fact, I was such a bad player, probably my first 50 games I never castled. Because I was moving my rooks. So I never had the opportunity to castle. Later, I began to appreciate that castles is a really good move, Because it gets my king out of danger. Yeah, and puts it into safety. Now, let's say my opponents would play, what do you think's a good move for black? What's a good move for black? Tigran, what's a good move for black?
I'm thinking F8 to
Bishop,
D6.
Bishop F8 to D6. Don't forget, the knight at the moment requires the protection of the queen, and the bishop would be in the way. Young man, Bishop E6, that would be an excellent move. And I think a lot of my opponents played that kind of move. Now remember what we were talking about, this idea of controlling the center, to bring all of our pieces into the center. How could I attack this pawn on E5? What's a good attacking move? Young man.
E1.
Rook E1. Very good. Now notice, now something else, something conceptual has happened that's really, really cool. Before I was always using my queen. I was trying to make an attack with my queen and a knight, a queen and a bishop. Now my rook and knight are attacking this pawn on E5.
Da-da-da.
Da-da-da. Yeah, pretty cool, huh? Now let's assume that my opponent wants to defend this pawn on E5, and he advances his pawn to F6. Do you think this advance is good or not? Who thinks this is a good advance? Not too many. How many of you think it's a bad move? Okay. So for you guys who have your hands up, I'm about to ask you a question. The question I'm going to ask is why you think it's a bad move. So keep your hands up for those who think they have the answer. Okay, why is F7, F6 in your mind a bad move? It would have been better to defend the pawn by developing a bishop. By moving the pawn to F6, one of the things that is wrong with this move is the bishop on E6. A moment ago, the pawn on F7 defended the bishop on E6. Now, after the move F7, F6, the bishop is no longer defended. Okay, fair enough, but how could white exploit the fact that the bishop is no longer defended? You know what I play? I thought this was a really cool move. Remember earlier I moved the pawn one square? Well, now that I thought my king was in safety, I moved it again. Ooh, how many thought that was a good move? Yeah, that softened up the pawn on E5, because what would happen if he took my pawn?
Knight.
Young man, what would happen? I could take with the knight. That's a good move. Young man?
Take the knight with D5.
I could take the knight on D5. That's kind of a reasonable move, but I have a really stronger move.
Rook E6.
Yes! Remember that move F6 that left the bishop unprotected? Ooh!
Done. Check.
Right. So what we just did together right now is how I think about the opening. I would literally talk to myself and I go, mentally that is, I would say, didn't he leave his bishop hanging? And I began to understand that in the opening, all my attention should be focused on the center, okay? On the center. So every move that I made in the opening then had a very, very clear guiding principle. My guiding principle was to control the center with my pawns and pieces. Later, as I became really good, I began to understand I should castle. I should castle. So if you were playing, you go, for example, to the club, and you sit down at the club, and you don't know your opponent's a stranger, you never played him before, and he played the move A2, A4 on the first move, you would think to yourself, oh, my opponent doesn't know what he's doing. And you would be right. And that move is the move of inexperience. When you play chess a lot, you begin to recognize who are the good players and who need to improve. If your opponent played the move D2, D4 of the starting move, oh, now you might think, just a second, I'm playing a pretty good player. Why is the move D2, D4 a good move, young man?
It's involving the center.
It's controlling the center. You put your pawn on the sweet center square. Now let's say, just for argument's sake, that your opponent attacked your pawn with the move C7, C5. What would you do?
I would take it.
You would take it, okay. And let's see the consequences of that move. D4, capture C5. Let me tell you that capturing the pawn would be the first thing I would look at. I always look at captures. I love to capture my opponent's material.
Unless you have to sacrifice it.
Yeah. So now we assume that now that we're a pawn up, we're doing great, right? That we're going to assume that black is going to want to recapture that pawn. So what do you think is a good move to recapture the pawn, young man?
Queen to A5.
Check. Queen to A5 check.
Not even taking
That does recapture the pawn. It attacks our king, and it prepares to take the pawn. But here's a question I might ask of you. Does the queen coming out early violate our principle of not bringing the queen out early? With the move Queen A5 check, respect to our opponent. He is going to win back the pawn on C5. But that principle we had of not bringing out the queen too soon has been violated, right? Our opponent's bringing his bully out too soon. So we think that this move is not so good for black. So how should we answer this move? Young man, yeah, what do you think?
Bishop E3.
First we have to protect our king from check. Young man.
Bishop D2.
Bishop D2. That's a worthy move. But now, this is where we start planning ahead. In our mind's eye, we understand that on his next move, the queen is going to capture this pawn, and then maybe we want to play bishop to E3, attacking the queen, developing with a tempo. How many of you are familiar with the concept developing with a tempo? This is a very, very important concept in the opening. First of all, I'm going to show you the best move. White develops a knight. Knight to C3. Black recaptures the pawn. Queen takes C5. White continues to develop into the center with the move E4. Let's say black develops a knight. Now here is that concept. It's a very, very important concept. Please understand how vital it is for you to understand. You now play the move bishop on C1 to E3, developing a piece from its original square, and you're attacking the bully, the queen on C5. The queen on C5 better move. If it doesn't move, you're going to capture the queen. So now you've developed with the tempo. Our opponent has to move his queen. Now, the black queen could move to B4, maybe attacking the pawn on A2. The black queen could move to A5. The black queen could maybe move along the 5th rank. The black queen could retreat to D6. Let me ask you a question to see if you understand the concept. Let's assume Black plays the move queen e5, which is a really strong move, right? Because it attacks our pawn on e4. This is a great move, correct? How many think I'm tricking you? Yeah, I'm tricking you. Why is the move queen e5 a bad move, young man? Correct. In the first place, the queen on e5 really doesn't attack. It does attack our pawn on e4, but if the queen took it, our knight would take the queen. So it's a fake threat. It's not a real threat that black has, is not taking. And with the queen on e5, it's vulnerable to what? Young man. Which is called developing with a tempo. We would eagerly, we'd be really, really happy about this, get ourselves all excited. We now bring a knight off the back rank to f3. We attack the queen. We develop with a tempo. What this is leading to is it's attacking the queen, and the queen drops back to c7. Okay? Queen drops back to c7. Now, white has 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces developed. Black has 1, 2. So we say that white has a lead in development. Okay? Of 4 to 2. What's a good move here for white? What move would you like to make? Young man.
Bishop to c4.
Excellent move. Bishop to c4. You bring a piece off the back rank. You prepare to castle your king. The bishop on c4 protects, or attacks rather, the square d5 as well as e6 as well as f7. That is an excellent move. I like it. And maybe it's even the best move. Is there another move that any of you find attractive? Is there another move that, think about developing with a tempo for a moment. Young man.
Queen d5.
Queen d5. Okay, in this case it's kind of a role reversal. We brought our bully out, but could black now develop with a tempo against our queen? Could he bring his knight to f6 or maybe his pawn to e6? We'd have to move our queen again. Okay, but I began to understand that the queen is a bully, but in the opening, if you could attack the queen, you could push the queen around. So I want to attack black's queen. Yes, young man.
d5.
Knight to d5. Now this move I really like. Bishop c4 is excellent and maybe the best move. But I found this move to be very attractive because I realized that the queen would have to move again. Ooh.
Back to its original spot. Maybe.
Maybe back to its original spot. But if it moved back to its original spot, it means from the very start, bringing the queen out actually turned out to be a bad idea because
It wasted time.
it wasted time. So this was how my thinking in the opening evolved. And I went from being a real beginning player to being a sophisticated player, learning to bring out my pieces and pawns to control the center, learning to castle early, put my king in safety, and keep a lookout for when my opponent brought his bully out so I could attack him.